did you get the invoice I forwarded? That was the first thing my daughter-in-law said to me when I finally reached her on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Not hello, not how are you, Gerald. Just did you get the invoice? I told her I had. Good. The supplier needs payment by Friday, or they'll hold the next shipment. I said I would look into it. She hung up before I could ask the question I'd actually called about. I stood in my kitchen in Oakville for a long moment, holding the phone against my chest, looking out at the backyard I'd spent 30 years maintaining. The maple in the corner had gone fully red. My wife, Patricia, would have called it beautiful. She passed 4 years ago, and sometimes I still catch myself turning to tell her things. The question I had wanted to ask my daughter-in-law was simple. When is the grand opening? My son, Trevor, had been planning the opening of his wellness clinic for the better part of 2 years. The clinic, a physiotherapy and rehabilitation center he'd named Cedarbrook, was supposed to be the culmination of everything. His education, his years working under other practitioners, the $340,000 I had contributed from the savings Patricia and I had spent our entire working lives building. I had retired from teaching high school mathematics after 31 years. Patricia had been a hospital administrator. We were not wealthy people, but we had been careful, and we had been consistent. And when Trevor came to me in the spring of 2 years ago with a business plan and a dream, I had believed in him the way only a father can believe in a son. I did not ask for a seat on his board. I did not demand my name on the door. I asked only that he keep me informed, that I be treated not as an investor, but as his father. For the first several months, he did. We spoke every Sunday. He would walk me through the renovations, the equipment purchases, the hiring process. He sent photographs. He called me excited from the site when the new treatment tables arrived. Those were good months. Then his wife, Renata, took over the business finances. I want to be fair to Renata. She is organized and driven, and she clearly loves Trevor. But from the moment she assumed control of the clinic's administration, which Trevor explained to me, somewhat sheepishly, was because she had a background in healthcare management, our Sunday calls became shorter, then less frequent. Then they stopped altogether, replaced by occasional text messages and the sporadic forwarded invoice. I told myself this was normal. Businesses get busy. Sons grow into their own lives. I had read enough advice columns in the back pages of enough weekend newspapers to know that a father who clings becomes a burden. But there is a difference between letting go and being pushed out. I was only beginning to understand which one was happening to me. The Friday after the invoice call, I drove out to the clinic. It was the first time I had visited in 3 months. Renata had mentioned, at some point over the summer, that the construction noise was too disruptive for drop-in visits, and I had respected that. The drive took 40 minutes from Oakville into the west end of Hamilton, through streets I knew well from the years Patricia and I used to drive out to visit her sister. I found parking easily. The street was quiet for a Friday afternoon. I walked toward the building and stopped. There were plants in the window, framed artwork on the walls I could see from the sidewalk, a sign above the door, Cedarbrook Wellness and Rehabilitation in clean navy lettering on a white background. Understated and professional. The clinic was open, clearly, unmistakably open. There was a reception desk visible through the glass, a woman typing at a computer, 2 people in the waiting area with clipboards. I did not go inside. I stood on that sidewalk for what felt like a very long time, doing the arithmetic of it. The sign looked weathered enough, not brand new, not installed last week. The plants had grown into their pots. The lettering above the door had a faint watermark along the bottom edge where rain had run down the wall. I went home. That evening I called Trevor. The call went to voicemail after 3 rings. I called again the following morning. 2 rings, then voicemail. He was sending me to voicemail. My own son. I sat with that knowledge for a day before I called Renata. She answered on the first ring, which told me something. When did the clinic open? I asked. There was a pause. Not long, just enough. The soft opening was about 6 weeks ago, she said. We did a quiet launch. Just family and a few close colleagues. I absorbed this. I wasn't invited. Trevor wanted to keep it low-key. You know how he gets about pressure. I did know how Trevor got. He had been a sensitive child, prone to anxiety before performances, before exams, before anything he cared about. I had always tried to protect him from unnecessary stress. I had never once, in 63 years of living, considered that my presence at a meaningful event in my son's life might be categorized as unnecessary stress. Renata, I said, and I kept my voice level because I had been a teacher for 3 decades, and level voices are something you learn. I put $340,000 into that clinic, which we are very grateful for, she said. Trevor will call you this week. He did not call that week. I am not a man who acts impulsively. Patricia used to tease me about it, said I could deliberate a dinner order into a full philosophical inquiry. But deliberation is not the same as passivity. And as the days passed without a call from my son, I began, quietly and carefully, to do what any reasonable person would do when they suspect they are being managed rather than respected. I started paying attention. I went back through my records. Every transfer, every receipt, every email exchange related to the clinic over the past 2 years. I had been thorough in my documentation, the habit of a mathematics teacher, and what I found, when I laid everything out on the dining room table, was a picture that had been obscured by its own details. The original agreement between Trevor and me was not a formal contract. I had suggested one, early on. Trevor had looked hurt. "Dad, this is family," he'd said, and I had felt small for suggesting otherwise, which, I now understand, was exactly the intended effect. What I had was a series of emails. In those emails, Trevor had described my contribution as an investment with family terms, meaning no formal interest, no fixed repayment schedule, but an understanding that I would be treated as a silent partner with the right to be kept informed of major milestones. His words, his email, the grand opening of the clinic was, by any definition, a major milestone. There was more. I began to notice patterns in the invoices Renata forwarded. Equipment I did not remember approving. A consulting fee that recurred monthly, paid to a numbered company I did not recognize. A line item described only as business development that had been charged against the clinic's operating budget my money, still being drawn down for 11 consecutive months. I am not an accountant, but I had spent 31 years teaching students to follow the logic of numbers, and the logic of these numbers was telling me something I did not want to hear. I called my old friend Douglas, who had retired from corporate law 3 years ago and spent most of his time now sailing out of Burlington. We met for lunch at a diner near the harbor. I brought the emails. I brought the invoices. I spread them across the table between our coffee cups and let him read. Douglas did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Gerald, do you know who owns that numbered company?" I said I did not. He slid his reading glasses down his nose and looked at me over the frames. "You should find out. I hired a bookkeeper, a retired woman named Carol, who did contract work, and asked very few questions to go through the full financial picture of what I had contributed and what had been charged against it. She took 2 weeks. When she came back to me, she brought a summary of her findings printed on 4 pages, and a look on her face I recognized from 30 years of delivering difficult news to students' parents. The numbered company received a monthly consulting fee from the clinic. The director of the numbered company was Renata's brother, a man named Paul who, as far as I could determine, had no particular expertise in healthcare administration or physiotherapy or anything else that would justify a monthly consulting fee of $2,800. Over 11 months, that was $30,800, charged against the clinic's operating budget, against my investment. There was more in Carol's summary, but that was the detail that stayed with me, clear and heavy as a stone in still water. I did not call Trevor. Not yet. I needed to think, and I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I said a word. This, I suppose, is the part of the story where a different kind of man might have driven straight to Hamilton and made a scene. But scenes accomplish very little. Patricia taught me that. "You don't win by shouting," she used to say. "You win by being the last one still standing at the table." Through a mutual contact, the husband of a former colleague who had done business with Cedarbrook's landlord, I was able to review a copy of the clinic's lease. I will not explain how, exactly, because it is not the kind of thing that reflects well on any party involved. What matters is what I found. The lease had been signed with a personal guarantee, not by Trevor and Renata jointly, by Trevor alone. Whatever I had been told about the structure of this business, the financial exposure was sitting on my son's shoulders, not shared with his wife, not distributed across any corporate structure that might have offered some protection. If the clinic struggled, Trevor was the one who would be personally liable. I do not know if Renata knew this when she authorized Paul's consulting fees. I do not know what conversations happened in their home that I was not present for. What I know is that my son was carrying a weight he may not have fully understood, and the woman managing his finances was directing a portion of those finances toward her own family. I called Trevor on a Sunday morning. He answered on the fifth ring. "Dad." He sounded tired. Not surprised, exactly. More like a man who has been expecting a difficult conversation and has not slept well in anticipation of it. "I'd like to come by the clinic," I said. "Not as a surprise. I'm telling you now. Tuesday afternoon." A pause. "Sure, Dad. I'd like Renata to be there." Another pause. "Longer. I can ask her." "Please do." The Tuesday meeting was not easy. I had spent the weekend preparing for it the way I used to prepare for difficult parent-teacher interviews, methodically, without anger, with the goal of arriving at understanding rather than delivering punishment. I brought Carol's summary. I brought my emails. I brought the lease information. Trevor and Renata met me in the clinic's small back office. Trevor looked like he had not slept. Renata looked composed in the way people look when they have rehearsed composure. I placed the documents on the desk between us, and I said, quietly, "I'd like to go through these together." What followed was 2 hours I will not transcribe in detail, because the details belong to my family and not to anyone else. But the shape of it. Renata explained Paul's consulting fees as legitimate support during the setup phase. Trevor said he had not known the full scope of what was being charged. Renata said Trevor had been aware. Trevor said he had signed off on consulting generally without reviewing the specifics. It was painful to watch. Not because they were lying to me, though there were moments when I was not sure. It was painful because I could see my son, this man I had raised, this person I had believed in, enough to give my retirement savings to sitting in a chair across from his own wife, and realizing, perhaps for the first time with me as a witness, that their versions of events did not match. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I said only, when the 2 hours were finished, "I need this," acknowledged formally. A written accounting of everything spent, and a repayment plan for what was paid to Paul's company. Not because I need the money, Trevor, because I need to know we are operating honestly. Renata said she would need time to speak with her accountant. I said, "Of course. I'll give you 2 weeks." On my way out, Trevor followed me to the door. Renata stayed in the office. He stood on the step with his hands in his pockets, looking at the parking lot. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I know you are. I didn't know she was paying Paul that much." I looked at my son for a long moment. I believed him. I believed that he had signed his name to things without reading them, trusted his wife to manage details he didn't want to manage, and built a beautiful clinic on a foundation he had not fully inspected. I had watched him do a version of this his whole life. Trevor had always been the visionary, the one with the dream, the one who needed other people to execute it. It was a strength, and it was a vulnerability, and in this case, someone had taken advantage of it. "That's something you're going to have to fix," I said. "Not for me, for yourself." I drove back to Oakville in the late afternoon light. The 403 was moving slowly, and I was in no hurry. I put on the CBC, an old habit from Patricia's days of insisting on the radio in the car, and I let the drive take as long as it needed to. The 2 weeks passed. On a Thursday, I received a document from Renata's accountant. It was a full accounting of all clinic expenditures to date, including Paul's consulting fees, totaling $34,200 in payments I had not explicitly approved. Attached was a repayment proposal, monthly installments over 18 months, drawn from the clinic's projected revenue. I reviewed it with Douglas over the phone. He said it was fair. I said I would accept it on one condition, that going forward, any expenditure over $5,000 required my written acknowledgement. Renata agreed. She did not sound pleased, but she agreed. What happened after that was slower and less dramatic than the events that preceded it. Trevor and I resumed speaking on Sundays. The calls were different, shorter in some ways, more careful, but also more honest. He told me things he had not told me before, that the first 3 months of the clinic's operation had been harder than expected, that he had been embarrassed to tell me about the difficulties because he did not want to disappoint me, that he and Renata had been arguing about money long before I became involved in those arguments. I told him he could have come to me. I told him that a father who cannot hear difficult news from his son is not a father who can be trusted, and I had always hoped, still hoped, to be trusted. I had never been invited to the grand opening. I had never stood at the door of the clinic I helped build, and shaken hands with Trevor's colleagues, and felt the particular pride a parent feels at a child's achievement. That had been taken from me. and I will not pretend it did not matter. But that December, on a Friday evening, Trevor called and asked if I would like to come to the clinic for an early Christmas dinner, just him and Renata and me, in the small staff kitchen at the back of the clinic, with food from the Lebanese restaurant next door. I said yes. I sat at a folding table in my son's clinic with takeout containers between us and a string of lights Trevor had put up along the window, and I thought about Patricia and about the 31 years I had spent teaching other people's children the logic of numbers, and about what it means to invest in something. Money is the easy part. You accumulate it slowly, and you part with it in a single decision, and then it is gone from your hands and out in the world doing whatever it does. What is harder is the other investment, the one you make in a person, over decades, with your patience and your presence and your willingness to remain at the table even when the accounting is difficult. I do not know if Trevor and Renata have resolved everything between them. That is their work to do, not mine. What I know is that my son looked at me across that folding table and said, "This would not exist without you," and he did not mean only the money. I am 63 years old. I have buried a wife and outlasted a career and navigated more difficult conversations than I can count. The lesson I keep returning to, the one I would offer to any parent sitting in the position I sat in, is this: a contract is not a sign of mistrust. It is a sign of respect. It says, I take this seriously enough to put it in writing. It says, I believe in this enough to make it real. My son's clinic is doing well now. The repayments arrive on the first of the month, every month, without exception. I visit on the second Tuesday of each month, and Trevor gives me a brief update over coffee occupancy, new referrals, equipment maintenance. He bought a new ultrasound machine in the spring, and he called me before he signed the purchase order. That phone call, the one where he asked for my acknowledgement before spending the money, was worth more to me than any grand opening could have been. I am not a man who needs to be celebrated. I am a man who needs to be included. There is a difference, and it took losing one to understand the other. If you are a parent who has given to a child, given money, given time, given trust, and you have begun to feel yourself being managed instead of respected, I want you to hear this clearly. Your feelings are information. Do not dismiss them. Do not tell yourself you are being difficult or demanding, or that love requires silence. Ask the question. Read the document. Request the accounting. And if your child is worth believing in, and most of them are, they will sit across from you at that table, even when it is uncomfortable, and they will work through it with you. That is what family means. Not the absence of difficulty, the willingness to stay.